Good evening, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jim Anaya. I'm the Dean of the University of Colorado Law School, and welcome to this edition of Colorado Law Talks, which is a lecture series that brings members of our faculty to Denver to talk about their cutting-edge innovative work. And we're very happy to have, as our featured lecturer this evening, Attorney General Phil Weiser, who was a longtime member of the law faculty and who were
on leave.
On leave, yes, I was going to specify that. It was only on leave. And we're very happy to continue to teach at the law school, even while being Attorney General as an adjunct professor. I'd like to thank the Denver and Colorado Bar Associations for hosting this event. Special thanks to Amy Redfern. Where's Amy? Is she here? She's the deputy director. And also Melissa Nicoletti, wherever you are over here. Well, anyway, in absentia, thank you. And I understand this is a new event, the new venue. We're very honored to be one of the first events to be hosted here. And before I introduce our speaker, although he doesn't need much of an introduction, I want to just let you know about upcoming Colorado Law Talks. Next, in April, we'll have Professor Richard Collins, who will be speaking about his work on marijuana law and regulation. Then next September, Professor Suzette Malveaux will be talking about her work on national injunctions. And then finally this year, in November, Andrew Schwartz will be talking about his work on securities cloud funding. The specific times and information about those events will be forthcoming, so keep an eye out for that. And so now it's my honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Attorney General Phil Weiser, who really needs no introduction. We all saw his ads, I think, when he was running for Attorney General, so we learned a good bit that he can push a whiteboard down the street and things like that. But in any case, his impressive history includes graduating from NYU School of Law, Order of the Coif, from his clerkship with Judge David Abel on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, being a law clerk to two Supreme Court justices, Justice Byron White and Justice RBG Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And then eventually he landed at Colorado Law, where he served as a professor of law and telecommunications and founded the Silicon Flatiron Center, one of our premier centers of ideas, research, and advancement of knowledge at the law school. And then he served as dean, my predecessor. And in between all of that, he served as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the DOJ's U.S. Department of Justice's Antitrust Division in the Obama administration. Now that's what you all know about him, but I've been given a list of a few things you might not know about him. He was a sports announcer at Swarthmore, where he went to college. He played baseball at Swarthmore. That's true. He credits being on the debate team at Swarthmore as one of the most helpful experiences of his life. He was a pinball wizard, or so some say, or is. He jousted on the basketball court with Justice Byron White when he clerked for him. I don't want to talk about who had the upper hand on that one, but anyway.
White did say, if I were 10 years younger, I would take you.
And he is a fast casual food junkie, I'm told. So the late David Getches, another former dean, remarked, I'm told, that Phil always does the right thing. And I'm happy that now he's in the position of Attorney General to continue to do the right thing from that position. So welcome, Phil.
Jim, thank you so much, and thanks not only for inviting me here, but for this innovation. This Colorado Law Talk series is a fabulous way to bring together students, alums, professionals. How many students do we have in the audience? Okay. How many CU Law alums are in the audience? How many non-lawyers are in the audience? All right. We got a great group here, and there's a tradition I often invoked on the campaign trail, which is a Yiddish tradition. Let me say a few words before I speak. And it is an opportune time to reflect on my academic experience and what CU meant to me, to develop as an entrepreneurial leader and to develop as a scholar of entrepreneurial administration. I absolutely could not, would not be here without CU. I came out here to work for Judge David E. Bell, who changed my life. For those students, I would strongly encourage you to think about clerking for a judge because that experience is so deeply meaningful. And for me, it enabled me to discover Colorado. The first time I was here was interviewing with David E. Bell. Then, after working in DC, I had the chance to come back to be a faculty member. And Hal Brough came and visited me when I was at the Supreme Court. And then there was an opening for a position in law and telecommunications. And Kurt Bradley, then of the faculty, said, Phil, you should apply for this job. And I didn't know what it would mean to be a law professor. And that had not been my plan in life, because my plan in life had been public service. And I thought I would stay working in the Justice Department or find a public interest law firm. And I thought to myself, well, maybe I could make this work. And CU Law, and Jim really embodies this tradition, is about engagement in the world and about believing that ideas can make the world a better place. And Jim's history on international human rights is part of what made him such a natural dean for CU in our traditions. And David Getsis would have been very proud because David had a similar path. I kind of feel like I'm sandwiched between two giants in the world of rights for indigenous peoples and concerns with our natural resources. And Jim worked in the UN, among other places, and David Getsis founded NARF, as well as a lot of other institutions. And this idea of institutional leadership is not always what people think about when they think about academia. I will tell you, having done both, it is harder to be an entrepreneurial leader in academia than it is in government. And in some way, my time in academia as dean and chairing committees and the like, it's sort of like training for a marathon in Colorado and then you go run it at sea level. Because you have to really work hard. In academia, professors, they don't have to do what you might want them to do, which means you've got to think hard about how you get people to buy in to an overall vision. And that's something that will always stay with me. What also will stay with me is the chance to build a center on law, technology, and entrepreneurship that Jim mentioned. The Silicon Flatiron Center was also premised on the same idea that CU Law is so committed to, which is thinking hard about ideas, getting intellectually rigorous and intellectually honest conversations can elevate public policy. And I'll come back to a few Silicon Flatiron's notes in a little bit. I had this incredible opportunity to work with a great group of people, help build the center, and elevate public discourse. And then I had the chance to go to Washington to work with President Obama and to put some of my ideas into practice, which also informed later academic work. And so for me, it's always been a cycle. It's been thinking about how do we improve public policy, how do we improve public administration, and then stepping back, asking the question, putting into action, and that actually is how entrepreneurs think, which is you try something, you get data on it, and you iterate, and you try it again. And it wasn't an accident that we developed this center, which is law, technology, and entrepreneurship. And we've been active in Silicon Flatiron supporting an entrepreneur community, which learns the same sort of way. When I look back at my academic career, what's amazing is this concept of institutional innovation cuts through a lot of what I've taught, most of what I've written, and most of what my public service work has been. And the talk I want to give you today, I want to focus on 3 points. Why this institutional innovation is so critical to making democracy work in the way Abraham Lincoln defined it, which is government of the people, by the people, for the people. Number 2, I want to talk about why Colorado, and pardon my parochial perspective, the Colorado AG's office in particular is so well positioned to be a leader on what it means to be institutionally innovative. And finally, talk about some of the challenges and opportunities ahead, which sets both a research agenda, but also an agenda for those of us in government. And then most importantly, I really want to have a conversation with all of you. And as a longtime professor, I won't be afraid to call on people. First, lawyers, the rule of law, and institutional innovation. It is not an exaggeration to say that we have a crisis of our institutions today. The level of confidence and trust in institutions, including our legal and governmental institutions, is at a low. People are often looking at these institutions and saying, I don't believe they're working for me. Back to Lincoln. What he said in the Gettysburg Address is we cannot let government of the people, by the people, for the people perish on this earth. Our nation is committed to the principle that we can make government work for the people. For those who've seen or listened to Hamilton, we had this experiment, an exercise in self-government that a lot of people said would never work and couldn't work. And we have demonstrated what it means to build a constitutional democracy around the world. That and our commitment to the rule of law was something of envy. And it's on retreat. If you look internationally, the commitment to the rule of law, to human rights, to democracies, it's not faring as well as it was 10 or even 20 years ago. 20 years ago, people were saying, oh, look, the fall of the Soviet Union, Western liberal thought is going to triumph. Well, right now, we are in an existential moment to prove that we can make government work. I'm an optimist, and my family's history, which I had a chance to talk about in the campaign trail a lot, helped shape that. My family, my mom in particular, my grandparents survived the Holocaust, and my mom was born in a concentration camp and was liberated by the US Army and decided to come to this country because they believed in the promise of America, which is a commitment to the rule of law, freedom, and opportunity for all. And that is a journey that I took forward, and as I thought about my path, as I said earlier, it was going to be about service, in service of these ideals. What I would say is, as you look back, it's easy to be critical of government. And you can draw a line, maybe back to Ronald Reagan, where he said something to the effect of, the 9 scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. That does a real disservice, kind of like lawyers' jokes does to the rule of law, to what we all need. When government isn't there, think, for example, Hurricane Katrina. People say we need our government to protect people. When government isn't there, people are aware of it. But it's easy to criticize government. I'm not a critic. Justice White was very much someone who wanted people to be on the field, not in the cheap seats casting criticisms. What's interesting about the Obama administration, and it's worth going meta here, you had healthcare.gov version 1.0 and the unreported version 2.0. Version 1.0 is exactly the Ronald Reagan mantra. Look, government can't do anything. They couldn't even build a website. It was a disaster. I'm going to get back to what we learned from that, but let me first talk about version 2.0. After the difficulties, a group of entrepreneurial leaders came in, Mikey Dickerson was famously, and they, through agile development, which is the way entrepreneurs would build something, came up with a very functional, cost-effective website that did work. Not only that, they took those lessons and created the Digital Services Corps to bring cutting-edge digital technology to government more generally. Let's talk about version 1.0. How did that happen? Well, here's the cautionary tale. I'm going to come back to this in the challenges. They did it the way they always did. When I started the AG's office, I said, I don't ever want someone to say to me, we have to do it this way because we've always done it this way. That's nails on the chalkboard for me. We need to do things the best way, and if we don't know what the best way is, let's talk about how we might find out what the best way is. But the best way is not necessarily the way we've always done things. And if you needed a powerful example, healthcare.gov version 1.0. That's how we always built government websites. We have a set of approved contractors that have to go through all this hoops and that have to do so-called waterfall development, and it was a disaster. I'll come back to that. But let me talk about a couple of inspiring examples of showing how government can work in addition to the version 2.0 story I already mentioned. First, Energy Star. Energy Star was because people in government had the following idea. That consumers wanted energy-efficient appliances if only they knew which ones met those standards. And so the government developed this Energy Star certification program, which has saved consumers, at this point probably billions of dollars, and has become an effective way at addressing greenhouse gas emissions because we're using less electricity by using appliances that are Energy Star compliant. That was an individual's idea who built an entrepreneurial program in the government. Let me talk about something I had the pleasure of talking to my students about this week in our seminar. Spectrum. In 1977, Ronald Coase, who's a Nobel laureate and a great economist, spoke before the FCC and said, we should be auctioning off spectrum. He was laughed at. Literally, the quote was, is this all some kind of joke? And then later, an FCC commissioner said, we'll auction off spectrum when an Easter bunny wins the Preakness. 16 years later, guess who won the Preakness? We had spectrum auctions, and Congress, once they saw auctioning spectrum, as opposed to the prior methods, which included comparative hearings, said all future spectrum is to be auctioned off. When I thought about spectrum, I saw we had a locked-in, let's call it suboptimal use, over-the-air broadcast TV. We had a lot of it in the UHF bands. And I said, well, wait a minute, couldn't we have wireless broadband operators who are dying for spectrum buy some of that spectrum? The people would sell it at a lower price than the people would buy it at, and the government could take the difference. And for example, this wasn't my example then, but we came up with it later, build a network for first responders that's interoperable and nationwide. I wrote that up as a paper, and people said, oh, that will never happen. And then I worked in the Obama White House, and we made it happen. So I believe good ideas and institutional innovation is critical to making our democracy work. And indeed, one of the threats that we face is inertia, which is we keep doing things how we always did things. But we in Colorado, this is our second point, we are pioneers. And let me again honor David Getches and talk about Colorado water law. How many people here have had the occasion to learn something about water law? Only in Colorado. Most water lawyers per capita. So we've got a couple ringers in the house. David literally wrote the book on water law. And what I will tell you is the collaborative problem-solving ethos and the institutional innovation in water law is like nothing you've ever seen. I could give you numerous examples, but let me start with one, which riffs off of the experience I had this past weekend, where I was in the San Luis Valley. In the San Luis Valley, because of changing climate, not as much snowpack, they've drained their aquifers. The state engineer, and this is a brilliant institutional move, brilliant, said, I'm going to give you, the valley, 20 years to replenish your aquifers. And you guys, bottom-up innovation, figure out how it works. And they created, within their river basin area, sub-districts that are working collaboratively to figure out the way they can use less water to replenish their aquifers with a lot of exciting collaborative and innovative activity, such that when I was there, Leroy Salazar, Ken's brother, said, initially, I wasn't sure this could work. He said, I believe it now. That inspires me about what we need to be doing in public policy more generally. Let me give you a second example that's fairly recent. We announced, and this was exceptional because it involved both me and my predecessor, a framework with the Catholic Church, where the Catholic Church said, we're going to open our books and have an independent investigation, Bob Troyer, former U.S. attorney, to look at all of our records and write a report and name names of any priest who abused minors and how we, the Catholic Church, handled it. Because we want to be transparent. We recognize there's a cloud that we need to deal with. More than that, the church committed to pay compensation to anyone who had been abused. Thirdly, we at the Attorney General's office will support a robust effort so that victims can have advocates to let them know how they can protect themselves, how they can hold people accountable, and finally, we will, where we can, refer matters to law enforcement and support prosecutions. That is a highly innovative solution. Other state AGs have called up and said, how did you get this done? And the answer is because we had the right people in Colorado working together to develop an effective solution. The final point is a chapter that hasn't been written. It's the opioid epidemic. This is going to call on our collaborative problem-solving talents in a way that will make what we were doing in water and what happened in the Catholic Church look very easy. The damage across our state, you can't overstate it. 90% of people in the Alamosa County Jail, for example, are opioid users. We have overdoses every day. We have people who start out often on pills and then find their way to heroin. This is going to take all of our resources working together, and we in the AG's office are committed to helping to lead this important effort. When we do this all here in Colorado, we then show our federal government and our nation what collaborative problem solving, what entrepreneurial administration looks like. I'm not going to tell you it's easy. Let me spend a few minutes on why it's not, and then, most importantly, get to our discussion. First, government often is hardwired, worried about errors of commission. If people make an error, and I'm going to mix up which is type 1, which is type 2, but Jim or someone can correct me. The error of commission is, oh, you did something and something bad happened. But government doesn't often keep score of when government failed to act and a good thing that could have happened didn't happen. Put differently, the fear of failure, the aversion to risk, basically sets you up to make a lot of, if I've got this right, type 2 errors, because we're not keeping track of the type 2 errors. And you can't manage what you can't measure, which means government lives in fear of doing something wrong as opposed to in fear of not doing something right. And what I, as a leader of an agency, need to do is to tell the people on our team, we can't be afraid of taking risks. We have to recognize that risk-taking is inherent because, back to healthcare.gov version 1.0, we can say, oh, we'll do what we've always done, and, pardon the metaphor, no one got fired for buying IBM. Well, actually, yes, if you're buying IBM today, as opposed to Amazon Web Services, you should be fired. And when I was in the Obama administration, people said, can government use cloud computing? And that was a novel concept. We cannot be afraid of emerging technologies. We cannot be afraid of experiments, which is why we in Colorado have the first chief innovation officer of any state AG's office ever, and she's a Colorado Law grad. That's Lisa Neal Graves. Come on, let's give it up. So as you have thoughts on this theme, whether it's the opioid epidemic, whether it's how we hear from consumers about issues happening to them, we need to hear from you. And we have a chief innovation officer. More than that, I want to acknowledge Kelly Brown here, we at the Attorney General's office is the first Attorney General's office to participate in a governmental entrepreneurial leadership accelerator program. This one is really cheating because there's only one governmental entrepreneurial leadership accelerator program, and it's here in Colorado. It's a uniquely Colorado innovation because our entrepreneurial community is committed to this form of collaboration. I spoke the other day at the Denver Metro Chamber Economic Development Corporation, and they said, we're helping out Teller County, which is not part of their portfolio. It's not part of their footprint. And they said, we're helping out Teller County because their workforce is our workforce, and their success is our success. So we have great entrepreneurs here in Colorado who say, I care if the city of Denver is an effective, innovative problem solver. And one of the earlier pilot projects involving engaging the elderly is now being supported and worked on by our Attorney General's office as a collaborative venture. And the opioid epidemic came up earlier as a challenge through this program. And this summer, the Attorney General's office will participate in this. Kelly, what's the date for the finalists? June 27th, you want to show up at this pitch night because you're going to see a group of teams of people who include CU law students. Ty can tell you about this later. It'll include people in the city of Denver, AG's office, City of Boulder, maybe the state of Colorado, Denver Public Schools, working together to solve problems using these innovative techniques. I am, as I said earlier, an optimist about how we can make government work in a way that people will be proud. It's easy to be a critic, but we can't afford more critics. We have enough of them. We in Colorado, we need to be collaborative problem solvers. There is a literature on how to do this, and my latest contribution is called Entrepreneurial Administration. It talks about how to bring these tools to bear, and I predict we're going to see more and more of these efforts explicitly and more of a culture that recognizes the need for experimentation in government. It's not going to be easy because the default setting in government is we do things the way we've always done them. It's going to take leadership and a willingness to experiment, but I believe that's what we in Colorado are going to excel at, and it's going to help guide our nation as we make our democracy work for the people. Thank you all. Love your thoughts, questions, and ideas. And as promised, I'm not afraid to call people.
Where do you see the Attorney General's office playing in innovation in healthcare and healthcare industry? Because the delivery of service through telehealth is sometimes stymied through CMS, not reimbursing through for telehealth that's outside of rural areas. But it certainly is something that could resolve a lot of issues that are not, particularly our rural populations.
So Mary, you got to talk to Lisa later about this. This is a super important point. Let me make a few initial observations. First, it's critical that across our state we provide broadband, because communities who don't have broadband are not in the 21st century. A lot of the innovations aren't going to come to you without broadband. And there's a lot going on there. Feel free to mention that to Lisa or I afterwards. Your point on telehealth is spot on. We need to develop opportunities for telehealth, and sometimes the regulations stymie technological advancements because they only will pay for essentially the traditional legacy service. By having creative lawyers, we first have the following opportunity. Well, we've always concluded this, but does the statute really require this, or are we being lazy and taking a shortcut? Because sometimes people will say, you can't do this, and my answer is, okay, show me the statute. And maybe it does say, we won't reimburse for telehealth only in person. We can change the statute. And we can advocate for those changes, or we can change the regulations. So we need to be thinking, just the way you said, creatively. How can we deliver services and support them in ways that leverages technology like telehealth? And let me add another point to you that Lisa and I have been talking about. You should chat with her. We need to move into a world where patients and patients' families have more visibility, awareness over their healthcare needs. Part of the promise made by HIPAA, I believe it was a mandate in the law, that people can get access to electronic health records in electronic form. This is unfortunately what lawyers call being followed in a breach, which means if you ask for it, good luck actually getting it. We need to fight hard to this solution, because we could see, for example, apps that know your history, know your current conditions, and can give you guidance on what you should be doing. Those sorts of apps can really lower healthcare costs, can raise quality, and in some cases, it's really important because you may not be near a facility. You need to know what you can do, and they might tell you where to go. There's a lot of work in innovation healthcare, and to give you another advertisement, Kelly, what's the date of the Silicon Flatirons Healthcare Innovation Conference? Tough one. It's on April 4th. It's on our website. We'll have Anish Chopra, former Chief Technology Officer of the United States, a friend of mine, along with local leaders, to really move this conversation forward. Mike.
So typically, standards arise when the cost of innovation is lower than the value delivered by innovation. Standards can be in ANSI or ISO standards, or they can be reflected in law. And because the standards reflect what's believed to be a best practice, then we place those in government, which is something that can't fail. Innovation is usually done in companies that can fail. That's how we determine what are the really good innovations. Despite the sort of negative slant question, I'm completely down with everything you're saying, but how do you get the benefits in government of the ability to fail when government's an organization that just inherently shouldn't fail?
Let me mention a few points on this. There's a lot there. It's a really fabulous question for those students. You might take this back and think about what kind of paper you can write in a seminar or in a law journal note. First, and I mentioned this in my article, Entrepreneurial Administration, which frankly, if any of you are into this, I'll be happy to sign a copy for you if that were, you don't get many readers, let alone those in the room with you, so happy to invite that. There's not every governmental area that should be innovative. The Nuclear Safety Regulatory Commission should not be innovative and doing experiments. Nuclear power plants need to function in a very stable, clear way. FAA, landing airplanes, you want to be careful. Now that said, you don't use 1970s technology to land airplanes. You've got to think about how to upgrade it, but you need to do it responsibly. And so first answer to Mike's question is, depending on the context, you have more or less of an appetite for innovation. Part of what government does, this is the other extreme from the nuclear regulatory one, is it actually catalyzes technological change. Let me give you an example. One thing I worked on in the Obama administration was smart grid technology that would enable the grid to basically tell you when you should be putting electricity into your electric car. Because the best time to charge your car could be 2 in the morning. In fact, you might even want your car to sell electricity back to the grid at 6:30 p.m. To do that, you need a smart grid. How do you set the standards for a smart grid? Government can actually be, and this was a word that Anish and I used, an impatient convener. One of the effective ways government could do this is they could say to a industry, the electricity industry, you guys better set these standards. We will help do it. And if you really don't do it, we're going to do it for you, which is the ultimate threat that government has. Government should never do the threat. A former Commerce Assistant Secretary, Mike Gallagher, a friend of mine, had this great saying, which is, standard setting by government is the prime directive. Mike gets the Star Trek reference. Not many people here did. The prime directive in Star Trek was you can't mess up any local civilizations. But they did it every episode. So government should be terrified of setting standards, should rarely do it, except when they need to. And when they need to, they should do it by stop me before I do it again, by doing it yourself. And in smart grid, that was what happened to develop smart grid standards. And the reason government shouldn't set standards, and this is a huge risk in cybersecurity right now, is you can actually be too prescriptive and you can handicap technological development and actually act in a way that's counter to your objectives. So I could keep going on this question, but that's probably enough for now. Ty.
A handful of other state AGs are pursuing some innovative antitrust action recently, especially regarding wages in fast food restaurants and non-poaching agreements between them. That being a field of expertise for you, what are some innovative ideas that you plan to bring to Colorado regarding antitrust?
First, I do have to set the record straight. The first no poaching case was brought by the Obama DOJ when I was there. And the individual from Washington who brought these subsequent cases was a year behind me in law school, great guy, Bob Ferguson. When what he said, and just think about this for a minute, these fast food restaurants were saying to each other, hey, if I offer $14 an hour and steal your wages, steal your employees, then you're going to offer 15, steal mine. How about we agree not to market to each other's employees? So these are people who are already making among the lowest paid jobs, who are being deprived of a competitive workplace environment. It's un-American, and it's illegal. So I would gladly join him and support that effort. One of the interesting questions that's come up in antitrust, getting to your point about innovation, is what room and how do we think about antitrust as protecting workers in labor markets where the employers may act with market power? And that is certainly an area that we're interested in looking at and being aware of. Time for a few more. Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about what your vision is for the criminal area of your practice and how innovation might manifest there?
Got a few thoughts. And Lisa, do we have a date for our forum that we're looking at? Is it April or March? March 25th. So I don't know if the people here are keeping score at home, but we have March 25th, Criminal Justice Innovation, April 4th, Healthcare Innovation, June 27th, Government Entrepreneurial Leadership Accelerator. So if this has been sufficiently stimulating talk, you can follow up on any of those. Criminal justice, this one is super important because there may not be an area of policy where we are acting with more of a kind of, we've always done it this way, we've got to keep doing it. What the war on drugs in particular and the tough on crime mentality brought us over the last 30 years is incarceration rates that have looked like this. And it hasn't necessarily made us safer, and we've seen some areas that have done experiments, for example, in bail. And it hasn't led to an increase in crime. Let's talk about bail for a minute because it's one of the most acute and obvious areas for reform. Right now, if you have money, you will get out on bail. Painful story from Boulder County. Michael Doherty, the DA there, mentioned this to me. They had someone who was in because of domestic violence. They set bail. He paid it. He went right to his home where he had a restraining order. He ended up in a firefight with the police. And when the pretrial services people talked to him later, they said, well, we just thought he'd never be able to pay the bail. So we had been using ability to pay as a proxy for are you a danger, which plainly it's not. What's amazingly painful that's gone on for a while is you could be a hardworking family person with a first-time offense, and it could have been based on a misunderstanding. You're in jail. And unless you can meet bail, you can't get out. And I don't know the exact numbers, but it's really high. I'm going to be directionally correct here. 65% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, which means they don't have money to pay cash bail. So they sit and they lose their jobs, they're apart from their family, they're not a risk to society, and then the outcomes, in cases of public defenders, he knows this, the outcomes if you're in as opposed to out are materially worse, and sometimes you just plead guilty to time served to get out, and you've got a record when maybe you didn't deserve it. That's not justice. We have a chance, and we've been working collaboratively in Colorado. Next year, I will, God willing, be able to put this in my speech of successes. A group called the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice. Literally, I'm waking up early tomorrow morning to talk about this topic. We need to reform how we manage our bail. It may well take a referred measure to the ballot. California's done this. New Jersey's done this. We can do this here in Colorado. And there are other areas too, just one, because I don't want to spend too much, diversion programs. If you're a juvenile offender right now, and you end up in the juvenile justice system, we know what that means for your likelihood of future, and it's not good. But what if you said instead, we're going to have you go over the summer to the San Luis Valley for an outdoor recreation program? Much more likely that you don't end up in the system. We need to be smart about this, and the federal First Step Act was a smart move in that direction. Programs like the Second Chance Center in Aurora that lowers the rates of people being rearrested and reincarcerated, also a really important innovation. All right, I know I'm holding people up for the reception, but there's a final question. Has the student asked a question yet? Ty did. How about over here? Any student questions? Silicon Flatirons, we'd always do this to people. We'd say the first question is to be asked by a student. All right, Virginia, you got a question?
Sure. Can you give an example of an innovative technique that you use to help drive these conversations?
It's a really good question. I'll repeat the question, which is what technique have you or can you use to drive this conversation? The short version is you need to be willing to bring people together, often from different sides and different points of view, and say, we are going to figure this out. One way is, back to Mike's question, is if you threaten them that you're going to do something, if they can't come up with a creative solution, it can be very powerful to sort of say, listen, we have to do something here. The status quo is unacceptable. We got to figure it out. So often you will start in this entrepreneurial problem solving not knowing what the solution is. But you'll start knowing you've got a problem and knowing that the way you're dealing with it is not okay. So bail's a good example. I don't know the exact best solution on how to get to bail. I just know that what we have, it's unacceptable. We know we can do better. And so we got to get the right people together, and that's what I have been doing, and say, how do we come up with a solution? And then get people thinking creatively, and then start asking, what have people done elsewhere? And not being afraid to try something that may not have been done before. We have one question. Jim, who's the... Oh, we got two more questions. Two more, good.
Okay. This is sort of a follow-up to the question about risk aversion, but on the opposite side. Do you feel that you have to take a different approach to risk in areas of commission and omission when it's not private money? And I would like to echo what he said, that sounds like a very negative spin on the question, but I really do like your ideas. Yeah. But do you feel that there's any differences in the approach when it's taxpayer dollars, or can you use the same mindset? It's
a really interesting point. The question again is, sometimes in an entrepreneurial environment, you literally have risk capital that you know you may lose. Where in a public sector, you're not trying to lose the money. The question is, I would say, the following. Can you really avoid risk, or are you only kidding yourself about the nature of the risk? And I actually think a lot of times it's that second category. So for example, bail. Well, we can't change it because we might let one person out who might actually commit a crime. So I would say, if that's your theory of the case, let's just put a number on it. we're spending this amount of money with this amount of economic damage with the goal of preventing one crime, or whatever the numbers are. If we were to spend this amount of money, is this the best way to prevent crime? By having a system of bail that it's based on cash? Or could we do a system of bail based on risk, deciding who's a very low risk, because you're not going to ever have risk as zero, but very low risk, and then enable people to keep their jobs, treat them more humanely, and save the money? I would say that if you say the public can't afford to take risks, you're overstating it, and you're giving yourself a perception of risk that prevents you from acting in a way that I see as common sense. Amy.
To some extent, with respect to opioids, it seems like government is doing what it's always done, suing the manufacturers at all different levels. And the manufacturers, in turn, are doing what they've always done, restructuring, so as to avoid having to pay damages. Are there other more entrepreneurial things that could be done, like trying to provide incentives to get more people into treatment, train more doctors so that they can provide that treatment in primary care? Do you have any thoughts on that?
We need to do lots and lots of things. I'll just mention 5. One is we need to license drug treatment centers better. Right now, I'll get the numbers wrong, but they'll be close. If you say, I want to license a drug treatment center in eastern Colorado, it could take you 18 months to get your license. We've got to figure out a way to get people licensed quicker while being mindful of the public health concerns, because we have about 30% of the current drug treatment that we need. And I believe innovative problem solving can help on that one. Number 2, you are right, we have a nursing and doctor shortage, particularly in rural areas. I would love to see us find ways to help enable behavioral health professionals to get scholarships or loan repayment based on serving in hard-hit parts of our state. Number 3, we do need to create a way to change the incentives for, we have the money for jails and prisons, but not for behavioral health alternatives. I actually am slightly more charitable about this lawsuit because I think the money that can come from it is money we deserve. These companies, Purdue Pharma most notably, did bad things. They lied to people, knowing they were lying to make money and believing that they'd get away with it. And as a principle, we can't allow them to get away with it. And as a practical matter, if we can get money from this, we can actually create an entrepreneurial opportunity to catalyze creation of drug treatment. Number 4, we've done better at training police officers to go with mental health professionals, kind of a co-responder model, so that when we meet somebody, let's say, who's not in good shape, we don't necessarily assume, oh, we'll put them in prison. In Canyon City, they're doing a great job rethinking their approach, recognizing they're not going to rest their way to the problem. And number 5, this is on all of us. We've got to destigmatize drug use. There are lots of people, our friends, our kids, our neighbors, our colleagues, who are suffering and are afraid to actually say something about it. If we can help destigmatize it, and you can get things like employee assistance programs better addressing it earlier, that's going to make a powerful impact on what is a crisis. So with that, I will turn it back to Jim to give us our closing benediction.
At the beginning, especially, you mentioned a lot of seminars and upcoming things.
Yes.
Is there, and if there isn't, can we have one-stop shopping where we can go, look, and see what you guys are doing so we can participate in these things?
Well, I will leave it to my colleagues. Is Julie here somewhere? All right. There are people here who can answer that question. I don't know where this gets listed, but do we have like a link for my talk with like the paper or something? If we can put up with this link for my talk, like the paper I referenced and these 3 events, Jessica's going to work on doing that.
Sounds like an opportunity for you.
Thank you, Phil, for a terrific discussion once again. Again, we welcome you to future Colorado Law Talks, and for more information will be forthcoming about those. Now we'd like to invite you to a reception down the hall where we'll be able to continue some of the discussion with the Attorney General. Thank you.